Hi everyone, I'm Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Lessons from an Old Quilt. Today we're going to look at this quilt, and it's a really cool quilt, but it is just the top. It's not a completed quilt, so it's what some people call a flimsy or just a quilt top. It doesn't have any batting, it doesn't have a backing, and it doesn't have a binding, so it is yet to be completed. I got it at a estate sale about 15 years ago, and you know how I like to save quilt tops. That's what I did. I saved this one, and I think it's really neat. So let's take a look at it and see what we can learn from the maker of this quilt. So if we take a closer look at this quilt, we can see that this quilt is made up of blocks, and the blocks are actually foundation pieced with a stitch and flip method, which I demoed last week in a video I posted, and I'll put a link here to it, where you actually build your block onto a foundation, and that's how this quilt was made. If you watch that tutorial, you'll see a sneak peek of this quilt in that, so check that out too, so you can just understand exactly how it was made. And we see that with this block here, where the first piece that was pieced was here, and then the next, and next, and next, and it goes in a circular motion. And we know that because it's covering up the previous seams as it goes around. So that's how most of the blocks are made in this quilt. However, there are some that are made differently, and we can see that if we look at this particular block. You can see that it was foundation, actually this side was foundation pieced, and then this was all pieced separately and then put on top and then appliqued down just by turning under the edge and stitching on top. What's also interesting about this block is that there's not just cottons. In this one, it's all cotton fabrics. Here we see some other fabrics, some suiting material, some shirting. I think that's shirting. This is a silk. And then we even see a heavy-duty upholstery fabric here. This maker used anything that the maker had to make it. So we see that a lot. Some of the fabrics have broken down, and we see that here. With some of the silkier fabrics, they didn't quite stand the test of time. But what's cool about this quilt is it's easily patched, right? So that's kind of neat. There's really, as far as colors go, sometimes it seemed like the maker stuck with a colorway, even with like these polka dots. And then we see one over here. I'll pull that. This blues, this seemed to be the same colorway, you know, but not always. And this kind of tells me that maybe as the maker was working on projects, they took those projects and maybe just made a block at a time, maybe over a year, you know, maybe these are all the projects that the maker made that year, you know, and it could be dresses or shirts or whatever, or quilts, and anything left over just went into this, or at least that's what I like to think. But the coolest part of this quilt top is the back, and we're gonna look at that now. And when I say that this is the coolest part, it's because I get the most information from it. So I guess it's really not the coolest part. The coolest part is the front with all the colors, but this as a maker is fascinating to me because I get to see how the maker made this. So, and that gives me a lot of information. Usually I've always been taught to use a muslin foundation and to build upon that. However, what's really cool, what just got me so excited when I saw this, is that this maker actually used fabric that you'd put on a front of a quilt on the back here as a foundation. So we see that here with this one, and these, it looks like there's three or four different fabrics used. This particular one up here is just, it was turned the other way than this one. So it's like inside out. Okay. And so the maker really didn't pay attention to that, didn't really care, it seems like. And there's really no rhyme or reason on which blocks got that particular fabric and which didn't. So I just could envision the maker having a stack of just scraps sitting there, some muslin, some not, and making this. And also, sometimes they pieced muslin together to make the backing. How cool is that? So what a way to use up all your scraps, right? Another cool thing about this backing that you can really see is the threads used. And this is another reason why I think that each block was made independently and was made maybe as the maker had a bunch of scraps sitting by his or her sewing machine, because we see different colors. And we see the green here, we see over here some blue thread, We see tan thread here. There's not a rhyme or reason as to what threads were used other than that particular thread was used in that block. I don't see a mix of different threads in any of the blocks. This is a great way to use up some of your threads that you have. Maybe you only have a little bit on a bobbin or on a spool of thread. You can use them up, and they don't have to match. You can have one on top that's different than the one on bottom because nobody's really going to see it. Another cool thing about this that I think is really neat is that the maker didn't stick with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The maker extended that seam allowance to allow for the bulk of the fabric. Really smart. Now, not all the points match on the front, but it definitely will give you a better chance of them matching if you accommodate that bulk by extending your seam allowance. So don't be afraid to do that. Keep that in mind as you're making quilts because that is important too. There are so many lessons we can learn from this quilt. As with all of them, I feel like I say the same thing week after week. Please forgive me. Okay, so the very first lesson I think we can learn is that you don't have to use a muslin foundation. You can use other scraps. Blew my mind. I had never thought of that before. And this maker did just that. Whatever scraps the maker had, the maker used. And I love that. That's such a cool idea. Why didn't I think of that? So I would say, make sure that it doesn't shadow through, but even then, I mean, who cares? Because it's just kind of a fun, whimsical quilt anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter. The next thing that I think is important to learn from this maker is to widen those seam allowances if you have extra bulk. You don't want to cut it too close, and you can see this maker did just that, made those seam allowances a bit bigger to allow for the bulk of this fabric. So that's an important lesson that we can learn. Not always being tied to that 1/4 inch. And if the project calls for it, make sure that we adjust accordingly. And lastly, use up the rest of that thread. This is the perfect project to use up those thread ends, and it's not going to matter. You're not going to see it. And what a perfect time to do just that. Use up some of that thread that you have laying around that you have like a little bit left on a bobbin. So perfect timing for that. And we see that with this maker did just that, used up different color threads and didn't really have a rhyme or reason to it. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Lessons from an Old Quilt. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. If you haven't done so, please consider subscribing, and I'll talk to you soon.